Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first podcast in the clinical trial and digitization series. My name is Sina Djali, and I'm joined by Hadil Es-Sbai and Ray van der Waal from Trial, we are here to talk about blockchain and blockchain's application in in conduct of the clinical trials. I'm going to start with Ray. And Ray, would you be able to talk to us about what is blockchain and hash process in general? We hear a lot about blockchain. We hear a lot about hash process. And before we go into what the implications are, both from a uh, technical as well as technical and theoretical, as well as a applied sense into clinical trials. Could you just give us an understanding of uh, what blockchain is to the naive audience, to a naive audience?
Sure, absolutely. So just to take one step back and sort of address why we are implementing blockchain within clinical research, we see that clinical trials have become increasingly digital, data-driven, and decentralized over the past decades as a direct result of the adoption of mobile technologies and devices. Well, interestingly, more and more of these devices are also owned by the patient. Think of smartphones, think of wearables. Um, while this is all very exciting, it does bring new technical, privacy, and regulatory challenges in an industry where clinical research professionals are expected to be inspection ready at all times. And not surprisingly, because of that, we see a lot of fragmented data and processes. We see that data is often scattered across different systems and devices, and at the same time, these interoperability constraints are also at the source of a growing number of data integrity issues being found during clinical trial inspections. So one of the core strengths of blockchain is that it can actually facilitate this end-to-end data integrity. And what we mean with that is that the integrity of data is secured right from the moment where it is generated until the end of the full retention period. And in that definition, you must consider that data moves across different systems and devices during its life cycle. So it might first be generated in a wearable device, then transferred to an electronic data capture system, and eventually exported for long-term archiving after a study is concluded. Well, to sort of answer your question there is what we do with blockchain is we take the original data input and put it through a so-called hashing algorithm, a hash function. And this hash function takes that data input, can be a clinical trial document, can be a data set, can even be an entire database, and creates a fixed length hash code, which is like a unique object ID. And there are two things important here that identical input values always create identical output values, meaning that if I have the same document and I put it through that hashing algorithm again, I will always get the same hash code. And the second important thing is that these hash codes cannot be reverse engineered back to its original data input. And this is really key because that means that we can safely store these hash codes in a public database, in this case, a blockchain ledger, which is an immutable database that cannot be altered. So by doing that, by storing these hash codes on an immutable blockchain database, um, I create so-called verifiable proofs of my clinical trial documents and data. And these proofs show that the data has not been altered, or first of all, that it was present at a certain point in time because it's timestamped on the blockchain, and also that it has not been altered since, because simply by recalculating those hash codes and comparing them with what is stored on the blockchain, I can verify the authenticity of clinical trial data.
Thank you, Ray. So the question that comes into mind, and I'm just going to give you an example, and
Sure.
would really appreciate if you can elucidate. So we let's say we upload a document that has a in TMF that has a hash code associated with it, and somebody alters that document, but they don't change the hash code. How does the system know to distinguish between that? Between the original document versus second version based on the hash code process? How does it know that the document has changed?
That's a very good question. So what we do is we built an API that allows the user to generate these verifiable proofs, and the API can also verify at a certain moment in time whether the document that was stored within the electronic trial master file is still similar, and that's simply done by recalculating the hash code. So the API creates the hash code again and compares it with the hash code that was already previously stored on the blockchain.
Yeah, and maybe just to add, because we're dealing with emerging technologies, and what always comes to mind is how do we implement this in a way where it is frictionless, right? Where we reap the advantages, but where we don't add or any operational barriers. Yeah? And the interesting thing about this technology, a lot of this stuff can be automated. It's even not visible for the end user. And also the comparison of these hash codes can be done automatically, right? So throughout the life cycle of the clinical trial, throughout the moment where a data object, which like Ray mentions, it can be a PDF file, Excel, it can be an image, it can be whatever you want it to be, that this immutable audit trail is being generated. And also the comparison is being done. And you could even imagine a setting where if you want to be able to compare documents, that you get this report, that says this and these documents are not the same. And it's also even explaining where, where the changes actually lie. And that can then be linked to actions, risk-based management, risk-based monitoring kind of process flows.
Excellent. Thank you for that input. So when we are talking about blockchain and bringing blockchain into clinical trials, you mentioned certain things such as interoperability, uh, data integrity. Can you first, Ray, talk about what do you mean by interoperability, and Hadil, then can you tell us how does this work in real life and real life examples in trial conduct?
Yes, of course. So like I already addressed that in an earlier question, is that we see that there's more different systems being used. So there's more systems, there's more data. And I think this really underlines the importance of interoperability. Unfortunately, we see a lot of fragmented systems, a lot of interoperability constraints. So we started thinking about how we can resolve some of the issues that we are witnessing. And if you look at interoperability, the problem is really two-sided. One part of the equation is ensuring we speak a common language. And there are several standard bodies that are working on that. The other part, and this is where we come in, is trust. So how can we trust the other party with our data? How can we ensure that the other party is who they say they are, and how can we ensure that data is not manipulated in transit or at rest? And this is really where blockchain comes in, through a combination of using these verifiable proofs to ensure the integrity of data, but also blockchain can be used for holding data related to identity and access management. And this means that you can use the blockchain as an overarching layer that interconnects all of these different previously isolated parties and systems. And I'm sure Hadil can address a bit more on where that would really add value.
Yeah, so thanks so much, Ray. And yes, of course, we're always thinking about use cases. Huh? So first of all, trying to understand as much as we can about the emerging technologies and de-risk those attributes to something that fits a complex process like clinical trials. So it means it has to be regulatory, it has to fit the regulatory requirements, the quality requirements, et cetera, et cetera. So if you think about the concept of identity and access management, then in the context of interoperability, we like to think about decentralized identity and access management. Like Ray mentions, the verifiable proofs that are basically decentralized identifiers and verifiable credentials can be used in several ways. One of the ways is, for instance, if you look at a document that is often a stumble block for CRAs, site managers, is a delegation log. So the concept of using a decentralized digital identity can be used to allocate accountabilities, responsibilities on a very granular level on site. And these decentralized identities can then be linked to somebody's qualification, somebody's medical license number, right? And in this way, you know that a digital identity, again, which can be an organization, it can also be a person, has specific qualifications, which makes them eligible to do some or specific study, specific procedures. So this is just a very brief example, but I think the concept here is really that we want to apply these concepts to really interconnect different parties and systems involved in clinical research. And we also think that decentralized identities or digital identities can be used for patients, right? For instance, in the US, e-consenting is something that's being used, but for instance, here in Europe, it is still not being used because of all kinds of regulatory hurdles. And we are currently working on a grant, that we received from the Dutch government, an R&D grant, where we're trying to apply the decentralized identity standards in the informed consent process.
No, those are, I think, going back to, there's a lot to unpack there, Adil. So, for example, going back to the delegation log, I could see that through the verifiable credentials, somebody has to do certain activities, such as taking certain trainings that can be verified on the system. Then once that's done, their name can be added to the delegation log automatically, and then they would have access to maybe IVR, IWR systems, or to the EDC system, either for purpose of data entry or for reviewing the data, and as an investigator signing off on that data being correct. So there's a lot that can go there into the using verifiable credentials. And the other question that you bring in is really important discussion, and is a hot topic, which is how do we bring the patients along in the journey of clinical trials while we are dealing with different privacy regulations, some more stringent than others. However, we need to work in the lowest common denominator is going to be the most stringent regulation. While we do certain things in US, if we want to get the data from patients come from Europe, we are we do have GDPR, GDP regulations, and so and that it goes back to something that Ray brought up on the question of trust and being able to trust the other party. How do we see this process bring that trust to the patients, to the study participants, that their data is being used in a way that is promised, and also that their rights are being protected?
Yeah,
I think, sorry, maybe if I can start, Ray, I'm
Sure.
sure you can add a lot of value to my answer as always. But I think the trend that we see in the past decade to move towards patient-centric research conduct is something that is unstoppable. So with the fact that we are moving into hybrid or fully virtual trials, it means that the patient at their home setting with their own devices are generating the data, right? Where we used to have more a site centric process, we're really moving clinical research to the patient's homes. So in line with that, it also makes sense to think about to generate the data where the place where the data is being generated, to which extent is really the ownership tied with that. And while we currently have the means through, like Ray mentioned, wearables or your phone to generate that, you don't necessarily get more control over the data that's being generated or have access to granular permissions in terms of what is yours, what you could also potentially monetize, versus to which parties you give controllable access, where you can provide it and also revoke that at a moment in time where it's suitable. That mechanism is not there yet. We think, and this is a subject where we talk about a lot with different stakeholders within trial, and we think that these digital identities, if you could look at them from a patient vault perspective, right, where in the vault you have all kinds of patient-specific information and that the patient controls, and they are able to provide on a on a case-by-case basis access to the sponsor, to the investigator, to a service provider, to other healthcare professionals, etc., and also know which party has access to which data. We think that if you look at it from a patient vault perspective, where it's very secure, right, and where the patient knows which kind of information is going where for which purposes, that this will help patient engagement. This will help compliance of the patient in a clinical trial, all the way to basically, to the end of the study. We think this is an additional incentive for the patient, especially if you tie with this concept the idea of reporting back to the patient. I personally think that we don't always very well explain back to the patient, what the result of a clinical trial was, what their role of the clinical trial was, the data generated for them, on them, and behalf of them, and where they were as part of the larger data set. Were they, in the middle? Were they an outlier? And also, what does this mean moving forward? So instead of only giving out data access to the patient, well, you can also bring back in information to the patient for them to also carry forward, in their own journeys. What could also be interesting there is just the whole idea of monetizing, right? If you have ownership of something, then you can also think about, how do I monetize this? And this is a philosophical discussion almost, in terms of, being in control of your own fate in life. But we think that in the trial project, we chose for a crypto component, which is a very granular way of person-to-person payments. That could be an example of how data exchange could be valued, monetized, and again, aiding the whole idea of controllability of data and ownership.
Yeah, I think that's a philosophical as well as ethical question about whether we need to incentivize people to participate in a clinical trial or not, but that's a discussion for another day. So Ray, you were gonna you're on mute, Ray.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch upon the privacy aspect. I think you hit the nail on its head when you started talking about the privacy implications of having blockchain involved, having more and more patients involved in their own home environments. And again, these standards that we're talking about here, decentralized identifiers and verifiable credentials, these are developed by the Internet Standards Association, who are really looking at it from a privacy perspective. So they are considering privacy by design principles, and what these principles allow us to do in combination with the blockchain, in combination with the right technological infrastructure, is to really work towards this selective disclosure infrastructure. So the patient has full ownership and control over how their data is being shared, what data is being shared, with whom. And I think that's really a game changer compared to what we're having now. And I think it's much needed, considering stuff like the GDPR regulations, which are putting a lot of regulatory pressure on different companies. So I think we should really think about this from a system way of thinking, where we can embed quality, privacy, and ethics into the systems that we use.
Excellent. So we did talk about, and I think the concept that we were talking about is the patient data vaults, democratization, ownership of the data. But what in your experience, what have been, or what are some of the barriers to adoption of the methodology that we are talking about? Is it uh, people just don't know enough about it? Is it on the technical side? Uh, what are some of the barriers that you have seen so far? And Ray, maybe this time we start with you.
Sure. Well, I think if you are implementing emerging technologies in any industry, you have a double role, both as innovator and educator. So we are required to put a lot of effort in education, um, which makes sense considering we are implementing new technologies that a lot of people don't know about. They don't know what the unique attributes are, and even more important, they don't know what the benefits are of some of the technologies that we are proposing here. So we really like to focus on the end results, the benefits that arise out of the technology when applied in a fully compliant way. And for us, that's a two-way interaction. So we are closely working together with clinical research professionals in the field to help us in the design, the testing, and the validation of all of our software applications. And we have numerous people that really act as a sounding board for some of the stuff that we are currently building.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, when you talk about adoption barriers, it's always how do you deal with change management? We're used to work a certain way, so we need to think about if we implement a new way of working, how do we incentivize people to work according to that new way if it's evident that that new way is better. Also, in terms of business model, right? If you look at the clinical research industry, then a large part of the business model of the service providers is based on, how what we call, administrative processes. And we think that blockchain, in combination with traditional digitalization technology, can basically disrupt that. The other thing is really you need to be able to have quantifiable evidence. If you want to demonstrate your added value, then you need to position yourself in a way where you can basically, for instance, have one study and where you implement blockchain, a place where it adds value, and then look at it from a quality perspective, regulatory perspective, but also research utilization perspective. I mean, you yourself, Sina, you're one of the one of the thought leaders, in our opinion, when it comes to risk-based management, using data analytics as part of decision making and program design. And we think that emerging technologies like blockchain, they can help us to basically, manage and oversee clinical trials at a way where we're mitigating risk and still have favorable utilization of resources. The other thing, I think, adoption barrier is just the stigma that sticks with crypto. The idea is, there are crypto cowboys, energy consumption is very unfavorable. It's not a very durable technology. And I think last but not least, it's just plain conservatism. We're operating in a highly regulated environment. So any disruptive technology will initially have to prove itself before people open up. I think it's a natural reaction to something that's new.
You're absolutely correct, Hadil. When we are talking about the new paradigm that's coming in and challenging a business model is uh, what value does this bring to the uh, to your customers, and then your operating model is how am I going to capture that value. And I think while we have a clear idea that this is a game changer, this is going to disrupt business model, in my opinion, we are still working on what are some of the changes that we need to make to our operating model and to make sure that we are capturing that value. What is the value of bringing a verifiable credential to a process, and how can we capture that value that brings in additional efficiencies above and beyond what we currently have? So those are going to be really important things that we need to think about, and about how we move forward. And yes, there is a stigma about crypto cowboys, energy consumption. 2 years ago they were talking about uh, uh, mining for certain cryptocurrencies where was consuming as much energy as Denmark as a whole country, right? So what's the carbon footprint of that? But that's not what we are talking about, and we are talking about something completely different, and we need to break that stigma. I'm just going to come to our last point. I want to be cognizant of the time, but how do we move forward? What are some of the next steps? What do we need to do to make sure that this is a success? And Hadil, would you like to start us?
Yeah, sure. So we need to think about enablers to really introduce emerging technologies into clinical trial processes. So that means that we should think about a toolkit for success. For instance, in our line of work, we're used to do business process mapping as a start, right? To understand how different processes, different data streams, interact not only from a process and technology level, but also from a people perspective. So this business process mapping and really panning out the areas where we have a problem and looking at which technology could be suitable and then just test that. The other element, I think, in terms of how we do move forward is make sure that there's further standardization. That is basically driving the implementation of this technology. So there are different groups that are working on standardization of digital identities and verifiable credentials. And we're quite lucky to have good relations and good links with those organizations. I think also making sure that you build the right consortium and that you have all the the stakeholders on board that are part of complex processes from a clinical trial, and make sure that you learn and listen to their problems, and that you have a solution that is scalable and it's also durable. And I think what Ray also mentioned, I think it's very strong, is this educative aspect, where we just need to explain and learn more every day and day. What attributes do we have at hand, and where can we use that? We see the life science field as, on one hand, very innovative, but also very conservative when it comes to implementing new technologies. And I think this is an exercise that never ends.
Absolutely. Ray, would you like to add
Yeah, I mean,
your thoughts on this?
yeah, absolutely. So I think one thing we shouldn't forget is that blockchain, in essence, is a back-end technology. So a lot of clinical research professionals will never directly interact with the blockchain, and it's also technology that goes together with other solutions and technologies that have been around for much longer. I think of cloud-based e-clinical applications. So in communicating that, I think it needs to be clear for people how their work is going to be impacted, but also where it's not going to be impacted. And there's already been a lot of standardization and good developments within clinical research, and we certainly do not disregard that. For us, it's really about innovating on top of validated processes and software, and improving on the way that we conduct clinical research where we can.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you, Hadil. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, this afternoon, and look forward to many more discussions. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us. Really appreciate it.